Dear learners and listeners, welcome to this session. Today's topic is Gender and Development Approach. This topic is part of the course Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change. The course code is BGSC001. I am Dr. G. Uma, Assistant Professor working in the School of Gender and Development Studies, IGNOU. I am also a co-coordinator for the course Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change. Let us see this topic, Gender and Development Approaches. As you all know, before I explain the Gender and Development Approach, just let us see the status and position of women in the world. If you look at, I have prepared this lecture by adding few data to make all of you to understand that the real status of women in the world. If you look at the poverty data, more than 1 billion people live in poverty around the world and a great majority of them are women. Women's poverty is violation of their human rights to health and well-being, food, adequate housing, a safe and healthy living environment, social security, employment and development. Along with persisting poverty, if you look at the women's position and status, they occupy only subordinate position in political, economic and social life. Hope all of you agree in this point. This situation is continuing till now. Even in the 21st century, if you look at the women's status comparing with the male counterparts, still the women are lagging in many aspects in the human development and other indicators. According to Mommsen in 2011, historically the after effects of colonialism and the peripheral position of poor countries of the south and those with economies in transition, rapid industrialization also had immense effects on women which resulted gender discrimination. The introduction of modernization in agriculture started in the late 19th century and early 20th century in the Asian and African regions. This modernization of agriculture and other sectors during the second industrial revolution, most of the sectors got modernized and industrialization has expanded rapidly in Europe and other parts of the country. So, the modernization in agriculture and other sectors resulted in taking over subsistence activities formerly undertaken by women. So, often when you talk about the modernization, we need to look at that. In a modernization and improving the technology in these sectors, what happened means most of the better paid jobs involving new technology went to men, as well as in the late 20th century and in the 21st century most of throughout the country we have globalized the economy. So, this globalization of economy also impacted women's lives in the same way like a modernization. So, like most of the because of modernization and globalization of economy and the introduction of the technology in every sectors had a negative impact on female members in the society. So, the existing studies clearly states that these studies were conducted in Africa and South Asian countries. It was clearly states that male income is likely to be spent on the family, whereas women spend their income to the welfare of the entire family. So, the modernization of agriculture and other sectors and introduction of the technology as well as the economic globalization resulted in the informalization of the most of the activities in the public sphere. This informalization of the activities resulted in making women to work in the informal sector. Most of the technological oriented formal jobs is with the male members in the society. Modernization of agriculture has also altered the division of labor between sexes, increasing women's dependent status as well as workload. This was proved by Esther Boschrup in her study on the African agriculture pattern after the introduction of modernization. Women often lose control over resources such as land and are generally excluded from accessing the improved agriculture methods. Theorizing that modernization has resulted in the loss of jobs among women members. One survey carried out in the year 2010 to 2011, that is called the Karnataka Household Survey, Asset Survey, carried out by the scholars and researchers and the faculties in the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, that Karnataka Household Asset Survey clearly shows that women owned only 60% of the total wealth in the richest 20% of rural households. In rural areas, 71% of all plots of land were owned by men and only 14% are owned by women. This was quoted in the Hindu, August 7, 2011. On the other hand, new low paid and low skilled jobs for young women are also created in factories producing goods for export. Due to rapid urbanization and the decline of agriculture resulted in rapid migration of male members to the urban areas. First point is that this globalized economy, first thing is that introduction of the new technology in every sector. For example, if you look at the primary, secondary and tertiary sector, especially in the secondary sectors, that is the manufacturing sector, modernization of manufacturing sector resulted in creation of the low paid and low skilled jobs for young women in the factory producing goods, especially in the developing countries like India, especially developing countries in the South Asian region as well as Southeast Asian region. These young women mostly became part of these low paid, low skilled factory producing goods. These goods mostly produced in these developing Asian countries for exporting Europe and the America. So, due to first one is that creation of the low paid jobs, second one is that rapid urbanization and the decline of agriculture resulted in rapid migration of male to the urban areas. This resulted more women are being left alone to support children. In some countries, especially in Middle East, South Asia and Latin America, women cannot do paid work or travel without their husbands or fathers' written permission. This is the existing status in the 21st century. By looking at the current status of women, the women are triply burdened as they have to do housework, childcare and elderly care, and are also involving in subsistence production of food along with few community works. So, every women who are involving in paid work in rural and urban areas, they are also doing the unpaid work. So, women are now they are working longer hours than men. This was proved by many studies. The pressure on gender relations on the changing status of women and of rapid economic restructuring combined with growing impoverishment at the household level is crucial to the success or failure of the development policies. This was studied by Janet Mommsen in 2010. So, by looking at the women's situation, various types of movements have emerged to raise women's status in terms of literacy, life expectancy and maternal mortality. Yet their position has not improved to be on par with that of men as well as we have seen already. Further, there is a clear public-private divide that constituted and operated in gender terms. Private sphere means that is it's exclusively for female members in the society. Public sphere means that is occupied by the male members. But most of the time, so women they expect to perform activities in both public and private sphere. So, they are triply burdened and they tend to work for long hours. Women are forced to be confined to the private sphere in some of life and their existence is restricted to domestic roles in most of the places. This can be, we can prove by looking at the existing data on the women's participation, women's work participation rate. That is clearly shows that existing women's work participation rate in India is around 27%. So, we are talking about most of the women they coming out, they are taking up the jobs but most of them they are taking in low paid, low skilled jobs and most of the time the women they are confined to the private sphere of life and their existence is restricted to domestic roles. To overcome these problems, states like countries like in India, they have taken number of steps after realizing the importance of the role played by women in economic activities as well as decision making process. Since the late 18th century, social scientists have developed a variety of theories to explain differences persisting among the human beings. Feminist anthropologists have argued that the organizations of social and production relations such as social stratification, the monogamous family, ownership of property and forms of work and production have greatly influenced the differences in gender relations around the world. At the international level, United Nations is a very important organization. It has contributed a major share to bringing to universal notice the status and the condition of women and incorporated women's issues in all development agendas. Eleanor Roosevelt raised the issue of women's rights in the United Nations General Assembly in the year 1948. The women's rights movement started as a movement for women's suffrage. During the 19th century, the Inter-American Commission on the Status of Women, established in 1920, was one of the groups instrumental in getting the equal rights provision into the charter of the newly established United Nations. Three international movements, namely the women's rights movement, the human rights movement, the movement against colonialism, and the women who are part of the struggle, paved the way for the starting of the women's movement. Along with them, women who had been part of the independence movement joined men in building their nations in the third world countries. This led to the United Nations declaring 1975 as the International Women's Year. Subsequently, the United Nations organized 4 international conferences in Mexico, Copenhagen, Nairobi and Beijing. All of us must be know the first conference is started in 1975, 1980, 85 and finally 1995 in the Beijing. So far we have seen the existing women's status and position from 18th century till the 21st century in a various like whether it's a poverty, literacy, economic independence, social position, in every aspects women are far behind male members in their society. First, that is the first thing you need to understand that. And from 18th century onwards, the feminists and others, they have taken various measures to mainstream the women's issues. In 1945, after the emergence of after the United Nations instituted in 1945, it took an efforts to bring gender issues for wider deliberations. So far we have seen these things. In these aspects, how the emergence of gender and development approach happened, that we need to understand that. First we need to see the emergence of gender and development approach. Basically, productivity was equated with the cash economy, and so most of women's work was ignored and the women's contribution to the economy was not part of the national account system. Example I can say, like for example cooking, the women they spend more than an hour in the morning and more than an hour in the evening for cooking and ensuring the food security of the entire family members. But are we considering their activities in the name of ensuring food security to the entire family as a productivity work? Are we calculating the amount or time spent on doing various reproductive activities by the women in the national system of account? When we ask these questions, we all know that no, whatever the women contribute as in reproductive activities to do the various household activities, taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly, that was not part of the national system of account. When it became apparent that economic development did not automatically eradicate poverty through trickle down effects. For example, economic activities it's happened It is supposed to be these economic activities. It needs to create a more employment. So, when you create a more employment, everyone will in the society will get employment. In that way, it is supposed to, we expect the economic development will eradicate the poverty and it will bring the benefit to every segments of the population. That is the problem of distribution and equality to benefit the every sections of the population become the major importance in development theory. When you talk about the economic development, it is supposed to be expect the economic development to eradicate the poverty and it has to bring the equality and equity in the society and it should benefit the every segments of the people in the society. But research on women in developing countries challenged the most fundamental assumption of international development and added a gender dimension to the study of development process and demanded a new theoretical approach. According to Naila Kabir, since the 60s, UN declared each decade as decade of development with the declaration summarizing the lessons learned from the past experiences and its priorities for the coming years. The declaration that announced first development decade from 1961 to 70 was devoid of any specific reference to women. I have already mentioned that the UN has organized 4 international conferences in Mexico City, Copenhagen, Nairobi and Beijing. First international conference in Mexico was held in 1975 to mark the celebration of the International Women's Year in the year 1975. At the same time, feminists in the United States lobbied to integrate women's issues into the policy of the government, especially in the US aid policy. Their constant efforts resulted in bringing in a new amendment called the Percy Amendment in the year 1973. This paved the way for integrating women-sensitive social impact studies in all development projects. The feminists also started using the term women in development, which comes under liberal feminism. But the concept of women and development originated during 1950s and 60s, but the Percy Amendment of 1973 ensured that women had to be specifically included in all projects of the Agency for International Development. The British Commonwealth established a Women and Development Program in 1980 supported by all member countries. In many parts of the South, women's organizations and networks at the community and national level have come to play an increasingly important role in the initiation and implementation of development projects. The WID approach I have already mentioned is based on the rise of the women's movement in Western Europe and the North America in the year 1975, that is the UN United Nations International Year for Women and the International Women's Decade, that is 1976 to 85. During this decade, it has led to the establishment of women's ministries in many countries. Even in India, we are having a separate ministry for the women and child development. In the institutionalization of women in development with policies in government, donor agencies and the NGOs. The aim of the WID was to integrate women into economic development by focusing on income generation projects for women. After criticizing WID approach, Women and Development, WAD approach was also propounded in the year 1975 in UN Women's World Conference in the Mexico City by the feminists of predominantly white women from the north aimed at gender equality were rejected by many women in the south who argued that the development model itself lacked the perspective of developing countries. They saw overcoming poverty and the effects of colonialism as more important than equality. Out of this grew a Dawn network based on the south, which aimed to make the view of developing countries more widely known and influential. The Gender and Development or GAD approach emerged in 1980s as an alternative to WID, WAD and GAD, because WID approach concentrated only on the economic development. See, after they realized that mere economic development would not bring improve any state and position of the women. So, after critiquing the WID approach, Gender and Development approach was emerged in 1980s. It has a theoretical root in socialist feminism and had bridged the gap left by the modernization theorist by linking relation of production and the relation of reproduction and taking account of all aspects of women's lives. Socialist feminists have identified that socialization of production and reproduction is the main rationale for the women's oppression. Thus, GAD approach focuses on social relations and it questions the existing roles that have given to men and women in different societies. According to GAD approach, roles that have been assigned to men and women in different society were due to the socialization process, and from this oppression began, and this can be changeable. Although the GAD approach does not question the significance of greater women's participation in socio-economic and political life of the society, primary concern of GAD approach is that why women are oppressed, why women were systematically assigned secondary roles in the society. These are the two questions the GAD approach is started questioning. The socialist feminists combined their analysis with the Marxist feminist analysis on patriarchy, and they attempted to address the concerns of women. Based on their study, the GAD approach has developed. Kat Young identified some of the key aspects of the GAD approach. Perhaps most significantly, GAD approach starts from a holistic perspective, looking at the totality of social organization, economic and political life in order to understand the shaping of particular aspects of society. Unquote. GAD is not considering women in isolation, but it takes into consideration of social construction of gender and the assignment of specific roles, responsibilities to the men and women and society's expectations from the men and women. But radical feminists considers the female solidarity and emphasize female exclusion. In contrast to radical feminists, the GAD approach welcomes potential contribution of men and women who share concerns of equity and social justice. GAD approach does not consider women's and men's productive and reproductive activities and lives in exclusion in the other. It analyzes the nature of women's work and their contribution within and outside the household, which includes non-commodity production. So, GAD approach rejects existing public-private dichotomy that commonly used and undervalue women's contribution to the family. Apart from that, family is considered as private sphere and states interference to the family are commonly opposed. Both socialist and Marxist feminists give importance to the women's status at the private sphere and gives attention to the women facing oppression at the family to analyze which conjugal relationships are based. So, GAD emphasizes the state's role and it stresses that state also should participate in promoting women's development and it should contribute. GAD approach clearly states that women are the active participant of development process rather than passive recipients of state as well as other agencies' welfare measures. It gives importance that women should come forward and mobilize collectively to raise their voice. It recognized the importance of both class solidarities and class distinctions, but it argues that the ideology of patriarchy operates within and across classes to oppress women. So, GAD approach focuses women's legal rights, measures to be taken by state, that is affirmative action, and tools to be developed to integrate gender issues in policies, programs by developing tools. It also stresses the importance of increasing women's percentage in all legislative bodies. GAD wanted re-examine the existing social structures and institutions and that changes to be based on the re-examining the existing social structures and institutions, changes should be brought in the existing structure and institutions to bring gender justice at all levels in all the structures and institutions, which ultimately brings shift in power relations. So, these are the references I have taken. This lecture is prepared based on these references, for example, from Sauntala Narasimhan, Jane L. Puppet, Peggy Atrobus, Janet Momsen, Bangkok Declaration of Beijing, +15, the Hindu newspaper, Population Reference Bureau, United Nations website, Maxine Molinox, Moser, Kate Young, Devahi Jain. From these authors and their writings, this lecture was prepared. Hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Gender and development approach has emerged from the existing WID approach, that is women in development. WID approach basically it is talking about the improving the women's economic status. After 10 years of implementing many policies and programs based on the WID approach, the feminists realized that mere bringing the economic activities does not improve the women's status and positions. By critiquing the existing WID approach, the GAD approach has emerged both by the socialist and Marxist feminists. They together they contributed for developing the GAD approach. Basically GAD approach talked about the existing social relations. So, unless and until we address the existing social relations in the society, it is not possible to bring or it is not possible to improve the women's status and positions. So, the GAD approach wanted to re-examine the existing social structures and institutions. We can bring changes in the existing social structure and institutions. By bringing these changes in the existing social structures, we can ensure the gender justice at all levels in all social structures and institutions, which ultimately brings shift in power relations will improve the women's, not only improving the women's status and position, they will be treated on par with the male counterparts in the society. Hope you understood this lecture. We will meet again in the next lecture by talking about I have mentioned about the various tools in this lecture. So, what are the tools, what are the concepts are related to gender and development approaches. These two things we will look into the next lecture. Thank you so much.